Okay, good. Welcome to our first Museum Studies at Noon event of the new year of 2022. And the topic of our panel today is museums and their communities, curatorial practices in Germany and the US. And I'm glad that you could join us here from wherever you are. It is a snowy, wintry day here in Ann Arbor, and I hope wherever you are, it's warm and cozy. My name is Kerstin Barmt, and I'm an associate professor of German and Museum Studies, and currently serve as the director of the Museum Studies program here at the University of Michigan. I would like to begin by acknowledging that the University of Michigan is located on the territory of the Anishinaabe people. In 1817, the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations made the largest single land donation to the University of Michigan, offered ceremonially as a gift in the text of the Treaty of the Foot of the Rapids, so that their children could be educated. We acknowledge the history of Native displacement that allowed the University of Michigan to be founded. Today, we reaffirm contemporary and ancestral Anishinaabeg ties to this land and their profound contributions to this institution. I will be moderating today's panel discussion together with my colleague and MSP Associate Director, Deirdre Hannebury. Deirdre will look out for and collect your questions to the panelists, who will answer them after we have listened to all three presentations. Please send us your questions via the Q&A function of Zoom at any time during the event. We will hear today from three renowned museum practitioners representing major history, community, and art museums in Washington, D.C., Frankfurt am Main, and Toledo. All three institutions have engaged in processes and curatorial practices that have challenged and transformed how the museums relate to their municipal publics and communities. In this process, they have also experimented with shared forms of knowledge and museum making. The presentations you will soon be hearing will fill these broad concepts with life and concrete examples. So let me introduce you to our first speaker, Adam Levine. Adam Levine is the Edward Drummond and Florence Scott Libby President, Director, and CEO at Toledo Museum of Art. Before serving the TMA in this role, Adam directed the Kummer Museum of Art and Gardens in Jacksonville, Florida, and served as a collection management assistant in the Department of Greek and Roman Art at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. After receiving his BA from Dartmouth College in anthropology, art history, and mathematics, Adam continued his studies as a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford University, where he earned his PhD in art history. Directing the Toledo Museum of Art has been a homecoming for him, as he had previously served the TMA as Associate Director, Curator of Ancient Art, Assistant Director, and Head of Visitor Engagement. So there is really, I think, no role that Adam has not had at the Toledo Museum of Art. His broad curatorial portfolio at TMA encompasses numerous exhibitions, including The Mummies from Egypt to Toledo, The Berlin Painter and His World, Athenian vase painting in the early 5th century BC, Glorious Splendor, Treasures of Early Christian Art, I Approve This Message, Decoding Political Ads, and Insight, Contemporary Sensory Work. Welcome, Adam, to our Museum Studies program. And I know you have had technological difficulties today, so I apologize. And because of that, I also didn't check in with the pronunciation of your last name. So let's do that first. Is it Levine or Levine?
It is Levine.
Levine. Okay, so I was right. Good. Thank you. Thank you. So welcome, Adam. And I look forward to hearing your presentation.
Thank you so much, Kirsten. Thank you, Deidre. Thank you, Amy. Thank you to the University of Michigan for having me. And I'm thrilled to be here with you to talk a bit about creating a culture of belonging at the Toledo. As you heard, I have had technical difficulties, so I'm coming to you from my phone since my laptop wasn't cooperating. And as a result, I think someone else will be sharing my presentation. So I will sort of periodically say, please advance the slide. Hopefully, there it is. Perfect, right on cue. And hopefully it will advance. So the talk I'm going to give today is going to very briefly focus on the sort of systematicity of our creation of a belonging plan. And as you heard in the intro, hopefully flow through to some concrete examples of what our belonging journey is starting to look like at the Toledo Museum of Art. But as a Roman art historian in general, in order to know where we're going, it's important to know where we've come from. So if we could advance to the next slide. Just to situate you a bit and then talk a little bit about our institution's history. The Toledo Museum of Art is just down the road from Ann Arbor, about 45 minutes south, down 23. Here you see an aerial shot of our campus. We have 37 acres in the heart of downtown Toledo. You can see I-75 runs immediately behind us. Unlike many other museums, we are not in a park, we are not on a hill, we are in the fabric of our community, literally surrounded by neighborhoods in 360 degrees. And as is the case in sort of the American history and the history of American cities over the 20th century, I-75 has not always been there. I always remind people that Toledo Museum of Art has existed in a neighborhood in 360 degrees for much longer than I-75 was there. And as is the case in so many cities, the highway cut off the historically black corridor of the Toledo area from the neighborhoods around it. So an awful lot of our efforts are focused on engaging our neighbors in every direction, including and especially the neighborhood behind the museum, the Englewood and Junction neighborhoods that we have historically under-engaged. The museum features sort of extraordinary artworks and extraordinary architecture across our 37 acres. We have about 7 buildings, 3 of which are core to our artistic programming, and we'll discuss those in just a bit. If you move to the next slide. So the museum was founded in 1901, and it was originally opened in a small building downtown. And over the course of the next decade, plans were made and the initial building was constructed. And you can see here an image of the facade from the building's opening in 1912. And at the date that that museum opened, one of the founders of the institution, and in many ways the person who, but the 2 people who spurred the museum at the beginning were Edward Drummond and Lawrence Libby. Edward Drummond Libby was the founding board chair of the museum. And at the opening of this building, he ambitiously said that the Toledo Museum of Art would relegate mediocrity out of its existence. It would focus exclusively on artworks of superlative artistic merit, only on works of the highest quality. And indeed, this was encoded in the building itself. Nowadays, in construction projects, when you get near the end of a project, you usually find ways to cut costs because you're over budget. Quite to the contrary, at the last minute, the trustees decided that they would upgrade the quality of the marble on the facade of the Edward Green designed building so that the building had the very finest material. So the museum has always had at its core this belief that we would focus on objects of superlative aesthetic merit. But of course, particularly with an audience like the building itself also encodes a particular semiotics. The building itself speaks to a notion of quality, which is filtered through a Eurocentric lens. And indeed, the collection was very much built in that way. So the notion of quality on the one hand can be an incredibly democratizing force, but the way that it has been leveraged in the service of museums across the Western world, and the Toledo Museum of Art is no exception, has been to focus quality through a rather narrow conception of what that term can mean. If you move to the next slide. And yet, it is our premise at the Toledo Museum of Art that quality is not inherently Western, that its use has been predominantly Eurocentric, that quality is at its core the most inclusive concept there is, that aesthetics understood in relativistic terms, that beauty without bias can be sought times, different chronologies, different geographies, and different cultures. That the opportunity is not to throw out quality, but rather to understand quality as a democratizing force and broaden the aperture of what is considered quality. And I mentioned before that our architecture is sort of as distinguished as our collection. And I think you can see the indication of this, or proof of this idea, in the quality of the architecture itself. The University of Toledo has its visual arts department housed in the Frank Gehry Design Center for the Visual Arts at left. And across the street from the Edward Green Building and the Gehry Building, you have Sejima Nishizawa Architecture Associates, Sana's first American building. These three buildings sit neatly together on our campus, but could not be more different in terms of their styles and in terms of what their building styles encode. And I just love this picture of the glass pavilion. For those of you who have made the trek down to Toledo, you know how beautiful it is at ground level, but here you get a sense for how the architects were purposeful in situating it in its landscape, situating it within a neighborhood. It's human scale, it's transparent. The values that it stands for are entirely 21st century values, things we're talking about here in 2022. This building opened in 2006. The brilliance of these architects on display and their understanding of the things that would be meaningful to us for a long time to come. The point here being that all of these buildings are radically different. The backgrounds of the architects are radically different. The styles are radically different, and yet they are all of supreme quality. The idea being, of course, that quality can be leveraged to tell a broader and more inclusive history, one that is reflective of the times and places in which things are made. If you move to the next slide. The museum has always had at its core a belief in expanding horizons, and we've done so as many institutions through our exhibitions program. One of the exhibitions that people in the region recall most, it's one of our most attended exhibitions ever, was in the early 90s. We collaborated with the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston to do the Age of Rubens show. But if you advance to the next slide, we've continued to do ambitious exhibitions and trailblazing exhibitions, but of course have thought about ways that we can reflect our audiences more fully, at the same time also reinterpreting and providing new lenses on our collection. The Age of Rubens made such good sense because we have one of the great Rubens paintings in America, the Crowning of St. Catherine, and we were thrilled to be one of the venues for the most recent Canada Wiley exhibition that the Brooklyn Museum of Art put together, which traveled through Toledo in 2017 and was installed in a swing of 10,000 square feet, but one of the galleries immediately adjacent to our Baroque picture gallery, creating incredibly compelling dialogues as just one of the many examples of ways that we've sought to infuse belonging into our exhibition program. If you move to the next slide. And then the Toledo Museum of Art is perhaps most distinguished historically for its belief in access and in education. The museum is in a metro area of about 650,000 people, and it receives, before COVID, the 10-year average was 380,000 museum visitors. So that means more than 50% of the people in our metro area visit the museum, making us one of the 3 most visited art museums per capita. And we routinely rank in the top 5 museums in terms of student visitors per operating dollar. Some of that has to do with the fact that we were the first museum to let students come in unaccompanied in the early 20th century. We were one of the first museums to introduce a docent program. And although there's much discussion about those programs at the time of their founding, it was sort of a very progressive thing to provide art education more broadly. And our class program has always been incredibly robust. Here you see a line of students lined up for field trips. You would equally see lines out the front door on Saturday mornings on their way to art classes. And if you move to the next slide, we've taken that sort of community ethos and we've rolled it into other celebrations. The museum introduced a Juneteenth celebration in 2003. That's sort of translated into this extraordinary block party that again has been interrupted by COVID, but had become sort of the highlights of the Toledo summer over the past few years. So we've really taken our commitments to community and engaging community and expanded it in ways that align with sort of changing perceptions of culture. For those of you who are familiar with LaPlaca-Cohen's culture track survey, and providing sort of a wide end of the marketing funnel for all sorts of individuals who may not be frequent visitors to the museum. So if you move to the next slide. So our history, in short, is very much about this notion of quality and this notion of connecting with community, whether that's done through exhibitions, whether it's done through programs that connect with the permanent collection. And there was this report which was written, commissioned by the Wallace Foundation and written by the Data Arts think tank at Southern Methodist University. Really terrific work is done there by the bosses. And I can't summarize the whole report for you, but I will sort of summarize the executive summary itself to give you what I think is sort of the headline takeaway if you advance to the next slide. It's that through a sort of quantitative analysis, which I think is actually fairly sophisticated, the authors determined that the cornerstones of high performance in an arts organization appears to lie in the alchemy of high standards and the creation of work that is meaningful to the local community. So this is to say, right, that these two founding impulses for the Toledo Museum of Art, quality and community, are the things which would seem to be more relevant than ever, most relevant to institutions, museums, as we seek in the 21st century to figure out a new museological model, one that is updated for the demands of our current society. So if we move to the next slide, all of this history, this research, these inputs went into our strategic planning process, the result of which was the following vision, that the Toledo Museum of Art will become the model art museum in the United States for its commitment to quality and its culture of belonging. So as I said before, rather than thinking of quality as something which is inherently Eurocentric and has to be dispelled, understanding that it has been leveraged in a Victorian Edwardian way, we seek to broaden the notion of quality, to treat it as the truly inclusive and truly democratic concept that it is. And in so doing, to create a gallery experience that reflects the culture of belonging that we seek to engage in all sorts of other ways. And the way that we're going to execute on this vision, the way that we're going to operationalize it is through 4 strategic objectives. And that brings us to the next slide, where we get into a bit of the meat and potatoes here. The 4 objectives are to transition to active outreach and engagement, to broaden the narrative of art history, to become an employer of choice, and to create a platform for operational excellence. The premise here is that if you give the best people the best tools, becoming an employer of choice and creating a platform for operational excellence, then you'll be able to consistently deliver on active outreach and engagement and broadening the narrative of art history. You need to resource those things, and you need to treat your employees as holistically and authentically as possible. But we're going to focus most of our application here, given the nature of this particular panel, on broadening the narrative of art history. Just one note on transitioning to active outreach and engagement. The museum has always, like most institutions do, done a lot of off-site programming, but our approach to outreach and engagement has been what I would call passive. We're a free institution. We're free every day, 309 days a year. The only days we're not free or the days we're not open to the public. So we are free admission all the time. But that's not enough. We know that there are other structural hurdles that get in the way of people's visitation. So we've totally re-engineered our outreach and engagement model to take the best practices of community organizing and bolt them on to art education, so that we now send full-time employees out into 5 different neighborhoods within a 2-mile radius around the museum, delivering art educational programming after school, the same time, the same day, every week, each week, in each of those 5 neighborhoods to really create sort of a different sort of relationship with our constituents within the immediate walkable area around the museum, which, as I mentioned at the outset, incidentally correlates with the most under-indexed within our visitation. If we move to the next slide. So I just want to give you some sense of some of the work that we're doing, but I think the key point is that as we seek to commit to quality and create a culture of belonging, it's really important to note that we are not seeking, and this is something that I think some institutions, not necessarily museums, but institutions in general, have fallen victim to, is to think that diversity, equity, accessibility, inclusion, and belonging is something that you add on. At TMA, what we're seeking to do is we're seeking to make it integral to everything that we're doing. So we hired our first ever director of belonging and community engagement. But if we really seek to make this work integral, then the job is no one person's job. The job has to be everyone's job, and more specifically, it has to be distributed in a way that delivers, that requires accountability across the organization. So created a cross-functional team, our diversity, equity, access, inclusion, and belonging team, and they developed a plan which was approved by the board in December, and we're designing it, and it will be published on our website in the coming months. It is a living document, so we're going to learn, we're going to report annually, we're going to publish that report annually on our website so that we can pay the lessons that we learn forward to the field, and we can also create transparency and accountability in our actions. If we move to the next slide. And at the core of that plan was actually a really simple idea, but again, I think it sort of gives some sense of hopefully the systematicity of our thinking. So what we did is we decided we had to come up with a mapping for how diversity, equity, access, and inclusion, DEI, and belonging intersect. And what we did is we created this matrix with diversity, equity, access, and inclusion on the y-axis and our on the x-axis. And we filled out that matrix, if you move to the next slide, with measurable outcomes. So we asked ourselves, in our transition to active outreach and engagement, what would it look like if we were diverse? What would it look like if we're equitable, et cetera? Same for broadening the narrative of art history, for becoming an employer of choice. And when we had those outcomes, we were able to build plans around how we were going to bridge our current state and our future state where we achieve those outcomes. And it's our hypothesis, if you move to the next slide, that is actually the integration of DEAI across our operation, which is going to result in a sense of belonging. That belonging is actually an emergent phenomenon, right? It's something that emerges out of the integration of DEA and I into all of our work. So this is to say, we have 16 clearly defined outcomes, one for DEA and I across each of our objectives. And those are the things that we are driving to, not just in our belonging plan, but in our strategic plan. So if you move to the next slide. So we have sort of signature accomplishments, as any strategy will do, sort of the big things that you should expect to see as we execute our strategy. And they're listed here. But I think for the remainder of this talk, the most important thing to focus on is that second one, broadening the narrative of art history. Well, what does that mean? What would it look like if we really did that? And the answer is, we wouldn't just diversify our exhibitions. We wouldn't just create sort of more inclusive spaces, but we would in fact reinstall the entire collection. The Toledo Museum of Art was reinstalled in the 1980s, and our narrative is 40 to 45 years old. It is dated, and it is overwhelmingly Eurocentric. We have 30,000 works of art in our collection. Only 800 of them are European paintings, but you would be forgiven for thinking that when you walk into our galleries. This is an opportunity for us to retell the history of art and to really think about how we leverage one of our superpowers, which is when we put something on the wall, it's considered great. That's an amazing superpower to have. So how do we leverage that into a more global, a more inclusive, and oh, by the way, a truer art history? So if you move to the next slide, and move to the next slide. So we've done that through being we've done that in part through intentionality in our acquisitions. One of the first acquisitions of my tenure was this extraordinary textile. If you can tell how extraordinary it is through a computer screen, then you realize just how great it is, by Bisa Butler, called The Storm, the Whirlwind, and the Earthquake, figuring Frederick Douglass, in reference to a speech he gave in Rochester, one of his more famous speeches, around the July 4th holiday. But we've also diversified the historic narrative in addition to the contemporary narrative. And if you move to the next slide, you can see here another absolutely extraordinary artwork. This time a 17th century painting, a still life of curacao oranges and lemons in a lobed dish, painted by the artist Louise Moyen, adding sort of gender diversity to our narrative of our European paintings. And this is a really important point with a collection like ours, which is to say that diversity exists across chronology and across geography. And we are committed to telling the story of that diversity through our acquisitions and ultimately our reinstallation. The other incredibly important point is both of these works of art, when they are on display in our galleries, own the galleries. They are terrific. It is another example of quality being sort of distributed broadly. If we move to the next slide. Now, and so with that in mind, I'll close by giving you a sense of sort of the demonstration project for our reinstallation, which happened in a place that you may not have expected it, which is in our cloister. We're one of only 5 or 6 in America that has a cloister, and ours is actually a pastiche of several different cloisters, but still a rather important space in American art history and architecture, and also, as you can imagine, a beloved space by our audiences. And in part because the cloister is a bit of a pastiche and has been thought of as an educational tool and is incomplete, it afforded us some luxuries to tell a broader and more global art history of the Middle Ages. So whereas you normally consider the cloister, the place where you will see works of art from medieval Europe, if you move to the next slide. Perfect, thank you. We have, for the first time in our history, also advanced, as I said before, a more global and yes, a truer narrative of the Middle Ages. So here you'll see, for example, the integration of African artworks into our cloister. And here we stand on the shoulders of scholars who have come before us. Those of you may be familiar with the caravans, some of you may be familiar with the Caravans of Gold exhibition that the Block Museum in Northwestern did. Incredibly important show. But in the same case where you see this 15th century, panel of the crucifixion made of ivory, you also see this Yoruba 16th century shrine figure also made of ivory, because it is true that there were not elephants roaming around France in the Middle Ages. There were incredibly sophisticated trade networks that connected the entire world together. And the supply of ivory was one of the manifestations of those networks. Those networks, though, were not one way. And the museum, for the first time in its history, has also acquired several works of Ethiopian artwork, all with sort of impeccable provenance. And here you can see a painting, a diptych, that the museum has acquired. It's impossible to tell a history of Christianity without telling the history of Ethiopia, which has a deep history of Christianity dating back to the 3rd century BC. But it is also the case that you can't tell a history of the Middle Ages without talking about interconnections between Africa, Asia, the circum-Mediterranean. And as you can imagine, while I'm showing you a spotlight example here of the integration in a meaningful and contemporaneous way within our cloister of African material, we also have the integration of Jewish material, of Islamic material, all done in consultation with advisors from the community and done in ways that have been extraordinarily well received since we reopened the cloister on the 17th of December. So for those of you who are within striking distance of Toledo, I'd encourage you all to come and visit. And with that, I believe that's my last slide, if we advance. Just a recapitulation of our vision, which is to say, it is through leveraging out, it is through integrating diversity, equity, access, and inclusion into each of our objectives that we think that we will achieve the culture of belonging that we seek. It's really about our commitment to quality and our culture of belonging together, as reinforcements to each other, that we think we can achieve this objective to become the model art museum in this country. And the cloister is a demonstration project for what that could look like as we broaden the narrative of art history. So thank you. Thanks for having me, and thanks for allowing me to lead off.
Thank you so much, Adam. This was fantastic. I am also very, very grateful that the technology worked out and that we did see your slides, which were really, it was just so good to follow along and hear you talk. And I think that your focus, your institution's focus and the strategic plan's focus on belonging is a really good, a good point of connection with the work of our next speaker. And we now also move from a major art museum in the US, in the Midwest, to a major city history museum in Germany. So our second speaker is Angela Giannelli. And since 2010, Angela has been serving Frankfurt's Historical Museum as a curator. In this role, she helped to develop the participatory exhibition format Stadtlabor, or City Lab, and worked on exhibition projects about Frankfurt's fashion, the city's gardeners, youth culture, and racism. At the Historical Museum, she is also the lead curator of the Library of Generations, a cross-generational memory project initiated by artist Sigrid Sigurdsson. Angela studied German and Romance literature and cultural anthropology at universities in Tübingen and Aix-en-Provence, and holds a PhD in cultural anthropology from the University of Hamburg. As curator and in her writings, she focuses on participatory exhibition practice and cultural memory. She is the author of Wilde Museen zur Museologie des Amateurmuseums, a book on amateur museums, and co-editor of 2 volumes on participatory museum work, The Participatory Museum Between Stakeholders and User-Generated Content, and The Subjective Museum that just came out in 2019. Welcome, Angela.
Thank you very much, Kerstin, for the invitation and for the very nice introduction. I'm very thrilled and flattered to present the work of our museum tonight. And I must admit that I'm also a bit nervous on the one hand, because it's been ages that I presented in English. And on the other hand side, because when we developed our participatory curatorial practice a bit more than 10 years ago, we had a very intense look at the US, and many of the museums there were kind of role models for our practice. I'm going to share my screen. I prepared also a little presentation. Okay, I think you should all see the full screen sharing now. Okay, yeah, so I'm very proud and happy that I can present you today our City Lab, the Stadtlabor, a format where we develop exhibitions and events in close collaboration with people from Frankfurt. My presentation will focus less on strategy, but more on the curatorial practice that we do. But let me first show you where the museum is located. So we are a municipal museum based in Frankfurt on the River Main, which is the 5th largest city in Germany. And as you can see on this map, Frankfurt is a city in the middle of Germany and also quite in the middle of Central Europe. And because of its centrality, since the Middle Ages, Frankfurt became an important traffic hub. And still today, the airport is a quite important European air traffic hub. So many people probably don't know the city because of the airport, especially overseas tourists or travelers. And another reason why you might have heard of Frankfurt is that Frankfurt is the site of the European Central Bank. And Frankfurt was chosen because Frankfurt is one of Europe's financial capitals. This is where we are located. We are located right in the historical heart of the city, on the shore of the River Main. And Frankfurt is a city that looks back on a history more than 1,200 years old. And more than 760,000 people live today in the city. And more of 50% of them have a so-called migration background. That means that their or one of their parents wasn't born in Germany. Our museum building is kind of an architectural ensemble of buildings from 8 centuries, the oldest one dating from the 12th century and the newest one from 2017. And when we had the possibility to rebuild or to build this new site, we decided that we want not only to be a museum about the city of Frankfurt, but also a museum for the city and its inhabitants. That means we didn't only want to explain how the city became what it is, that means focus on the characteristics of the city, but we also wanted to create possibilities for people to really engage with the museum and also to collaborate and co-create on the content. Yeah, Frankfurt has a very diverse population, at least for German cities. So that means that the people living in the city, they do not share the same history or culture, religion or language. That means we do not really have the same or comparable background. But what we do share is the city space. So that was the starting point for our participatory curatorial practices. We think that everybody is an expert of the city. And everyone has kind of an expertise about the city developed by using this city and experiencing the city in everyday life. And we wanted the museum to be a place where this experience can be made visible and also shared with other people. As experience is a kind of unconscious or intangible knowledge, the first step in our collaborative process consists in bringing this knowledge into consciousness. That means to make it tangible, visible, shareable, and also discussable. That's why we created the Stadtlabor, the City Lab. In this chart, we try to visualize the process. So the city is kind of the object we're analyzing and researching together. You can see it in this kind of laboratory bottle. And with a laboratory, we think it's kind of a symbol also for the museum as a third space. That means the museum gives the opportunity to step back from everyday life, to take kind of an artificial distance to your everyday experience and to look at the city through this distance. And this, this gives you the possibility also to get conscious of your experience or of this unconscious knowledge about the city. The research process is done collaboratively by curators and people from Frankfurt. The participants, we call them the City Labbers. And then there are different outcomes. That means we create exhibitions or events or city tours or also digital contributions. And I would like to focus a bit on the collaborative curatorial practice now. We work with the concept of shared expertise. That means that the City Labbers are considered as the experts of the subject matter. So they bring this expertise. And we as the curators bring in our curatorial experience. That is the know-how, how to make an exhibition, what is an object, how can you make a display or bring something on display. We also are kind of the project managers and we finance the project. The whole process takes more or less a year and is structured by several workshops. And this workshop series for us is really fundamental because we think that the discussions that we have together during these workshops, they are really important, not only because it's important to exchange different views, but also by doing this, we can avoid that the contributions in the City Lab exhibitions are kind of mere positions of individual subjective positions. Only by exchanging views and positions, new intersubjective knowledge about the city is created. So indeed, we think of the City Lab as a kind of collaborative research method or kind of a research practice that we adopt to create or gather new knowledge about the city. And we operate with the concept of knowledge that is not limited to scientific knowledge, but I think, as I said, it also comprehends other forms of knowledge like bodily knowledge or experience, or knowledge gathered by experience. And I think a museum is a good place where you can get conscious about those other kinds of knowledge and present it. The discussions are really important because I think we're living in times where alternative facts and conspiracy theories are circulating and getting really dangerous for individuals, but also for society as a whole. And I think that's why museums have to be really careful how they conceive knowledge and how they present it. And we can't just limit ourselves to present individual or subjective positions. We can tell individual stories, but there has to be a focus on sharing stories, that is on the discussion and debate within the group or also later with the public. And only by doing this, we can really create knowledge and not just represent opinions. I would like to have a quick look at some of the more than 15 projects we did since 2010. In the beginning, we did not have a building because the museum was a big construction site. That's why the first exhibitions were always done in spaces outside the museum. And we focused on locations in those first years. That means on city quarters, like here in the Ost End, the so-called East End, or a big outdoor swimming pool. We also did a project in another city quarter, which was on display in the venue of a local sports club. Or this is also an exhibition about the city quarter called Gallus that was on display in the showroom of a former car dealer. In 2015, this cargo bike was also became one of our tools. We use it as a mobile booth until today. And it's a very good tool to get in touch with people, to promote projects or to find participants for the exhibitions, or also to find subjects. So on which subject should we do the next exhibition? And we really also use it for field research when we prepare projects. In 2017, when we moved to our new building, we also kind of tried to adopt the method to work with collections. So we also tried to work in kind of revisiting collections projects. We did this, for example, with our so-called migration collection, which was a poorly documented collection of objects, kind of leftovers or relics of an exhibition about migration in Frankfurt. And we tried to contextualize those objects together with experts. And the experts were kind of biographical experts or experts that had a professional or scientific background concerning migration. And with turning to kind of these overall subjects and no longer kind of focusing on geographically defined exhibitions, I think also that our projects got more and more political, in the sense that the museum became also more and more conscious about its position in society and also its social responsibility. So today we not only conceive ourselves as a museum for the diverse and democratic society, but we also try to overtly communicate from this position. And I would like to skip to an exhibition now in 2019-20 that I also curated and was called Hardly an Ordinary Life, Stories of Work, Migration and Family. in this exhibition, we claim that the history of migration to Germany has to be conceived as German history, not as the history of migrants or, let's say, minorities. This might sound strange for you in the US, as immigration is a kind of a central fact for US American history. But in Germany, the fact that we are an immigration country is only common sense since a couple of years. So unfortunately, there still are a lot of homogeneous concepts about who or what is German that are circulating today. And for us, it really was important for us, I mean, the curators or the museum and the participants, to make this claim about that migration being German history, or migrational history being German history. In 2020-21, we went a step further. There we presented an exhibition about racism, resistance, and empowerment. And this exhibition was developed together with activists or people who know what discrimination means. And we responded by this setting to their demand for the museum to be a safe or brave space, and their wish to create also a space for empowerment. I have not been the curator of this exhibition. There was 3 other colleagues of mine who took care of this project, but I followed this project, and I have to say that it really changed my curatorial practice. Because of this project, more than before, I really feel that museums have to act in the service of society and that we are active players. In Germany, there's still the kind of belief that museums have to be neutral, objective institutions. And for us in the Historical Museum in Frankfurt, it is really kind of common sense that you can't be neutral. You are always positioned, and that we prefer today to really, operate overtly with this position, with being positioned as an active player for a democratic and diverse society. So to come to an end, I would say that our collaborative curatorial practice is one means to work with communities and also to share authorship. So it's not the museum researching and then kind of transmitting this knowledge to people, but it's a kind of a collaborative research tool where we gather new knowledge about the city by working with different people, and also kind of, and then we make the exhibitions and we can communicate this knowledge and make it discussable then with other people. What I learned from collaborative curating, that the curatorial process, it's a pedagogical process or a research process, a collaborative research process, where new meanings are gathered and nobody remains unchanged by this process. So not the participants, not the museum, nor we as curators. So everyone can feel or, well, the change is visible for everyone. And participation, it's not about, it's not marketing. So it's not for gathering new target groups. It's not about communicating or reaching new audiences. For me, it's really about research, about getting new knowledge about the city, of opening up this knowledge about the city. And if I could make a wish, I would really like to find tools how to measure this. How can you measure the impact of participation? So you can do it by qualitative research, but in Germany, this is very underdeveloped. When you think of exhibitions, we still stick to visitor numbers when we talk about the success of an exhibition. And I think it's not about quantity, it's about quality. And I would really like to find kind of tools or methods how to measure this impact of a participatory curatorial practice. And this is how I would like to end my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Angela. This was wonderful. And I have to say, as a Berliner, I grew up in Berlin. Frankfurt is, whenever I am in Frankfurt, landing at the airport or visiting friends, I go to the Historische Stadtmuseum, because this is just, all of your curatorial work is inspiring and has influenced my work as a museum studies scholar. But the City Lab in particular has really caught my eye and has been an inspiration. So thank you for being here, that we could make this happen, that you're part of this panel. And thank you for your presentation. So
I apologize for my poor English.
No, it is, don't apologize, Angela. It was fantastic. Okay, so our third and final speaker, and I am very, very much looking forward to this presentation as well, is Samir Megali, and he is Senior Curator at the Smithsonian Institution's Anacostia Community Museum in Washington, D.C., and a visiting scholar in residence at American University's Metropolitan Policy Center. He received his BA from the University of Pennsylvania and his PhD in history from Columbia University. Samir's research, teaching, and curatorial work have focused on social movements, urban history, and cultural history. He's the co-author of the global SCIFA, Hip Hop Culture and Consciousness, and co-editor of New Perspectives on the History of Marcus Garvey, the UNIA, and the African Diaspora. Samir's most recent exhibition projects include an exhibition exploring the history and contemporary dynamics of neighborhood change and community activism in Washington, D.C., entitled A Right to the City, and a newly opened outdoor and indoor exhibition about food justice issues entitled Food for the People, Eating and Activism in Greater Washington. Welcome, Samir.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Kirsten, and also thank you and Amy and Deirdre for all of your work in pulling this great discussion together. It's really wonderful to be with you all virtually to be in dialogue about these important issues. I'll be sharing a bit about the history of our museum, the Anacostia Community Museum, and really offering one recent exhibition project as a kind of an example of how we do our deeply community based and community collaborative museological, our work, our curatorial practice. So bear with me as I pull up my slides here. I want to first start by saying something about our location, because and also our history, as I mentioned, because it speaks so much to the nature of our work. We're the Smithsonian's only community museum. It's only a museum with a local focus on the greater Washington, D.C. area. As you can see in the map on the upper left, which shows the majority of the Smithsonian museums, which are on the National Mall in the heart of Washington, D.C. And in the map on the lower right, where we're located, east of the Anacostia River, which in important ways has been a kind of, historically within the city, a kind of social, economic, and racial barrier. And so it was in the mid-1960s, the then Secretary of the Smithsonian, Dillon Ripley, in the midst of the civil rights and emerging Black Power movements, really reckoning with the fact that the Smithsonian had theretofore at least not meaningfully documented, preserved, shared, celebrated the rich history and culture of the many communities that make up the United States, and certainly even locally in DC. By this time in the mid-1960s, DC had become a majority African-American city, the first major US city to have a majority African-American population. And so he had this idea of opening up a Smithsonian museum off of the National Mall in a DC neighborhood that could do that work of working collaboratively with local communities. And thus, the Anacostia Neighborhood Museum, as we were first known as, came to be. And that was in the fall of 1967. We were established and created at this, what was a former theater called the Carver Theater in the Anacostia neighborhood. There on the map, as I showed on a previous slide, east of the Anacostia River. I think that for one thing, it's important to note that our museum was really established as an experiment and really trying to challenge the norms of the museum field, really trying to rethink the role that museums can play in community and in society, working collaboratively with communities to develop exhibitions and programming that would speak to the immediate and sometimes urgent needs and interests of local communities. And I think one really important decision that was made that shaped not only the early years of our museum, but I would say in many ways, our museum in the years since was the selection of our founding director, John Kennard, who, when he was hired in 1967, had actually zero museum experience. But what he brought to the table was a really rich background as a organizer, community organizer, civil rights activist, and a pastor, a minister. And so he brought that to the table, and the founding staff similarly brought a kind of ethos that was rooted in this notion that museums ought to work closely and collaboratively with communities to ensure that the exhibitions and programming spoke to their needs and interests. And so they set about doing that work. And these are just a few images from our museum's early years. This is the Anacostia Historical Society, which was created by the museum as an effort to work with local community members to document and preserve the neighborhood's rich history. This is as the site was being renovated for the opening of the museum. The museum worked with young people from the neighborhood to renovate. And again, in addition to really brainstorming exhibitions and programming ideas, the museum had in its early years and for many years a youth advisory council with young people from the neighborhood. And there was also a mobile museum, which I'm happy to say more about, particularly as we've collaborated with the more recent kind of manifestation or incarnation of a kind of mobile humanities truck, a mobile museum. And I'll just mention quickly one early exhibition of the museum that the museum did that I think spoke to the approach and to the ethos, was this exhibition, which caused quite a stir in the museum world at the time. And it came about because the museum, when it first opened, had a small petting zoo. And among the things in the petting zoo were hamsters or gerbils, which the neighborhood kids mistook for rats. And the reason that they mistook those gerbils or hamsters for rats was because in the neighborhood, as was the case in certain neighborhoods in Washington, D.C., there were rat infestations. And so the young people were really curious to learn more about these rodents that were overtaking the neighborhood. And so the idea was developed to really do an exhibition that looked at not just the rat itself or the particular species, the Norway rat that infested American cities, but the broader issues of urban ecology, social inequality, and thus this exhibition, The Rat, Man's Invited Affliction, which really looked at not only historically why particular communities or neighborhoods were disproportionately affected by rat infestation, but also in that particular contemporary moment, looking at community efforts to address those issues around environmental inequalities and social injustice. And these are just an image or two from that exhibition, which again, at the time, the fact that a museum and a Smithsonian museum, no less, would broach such an issue as rat infestation really caused quite a stir. But I think it really also helped set the tone and kind of was an expression of the commitment of the museum to work closely with local communities to do exhibitions that address, again, their needs and interests. So our mission today is, together with local communities, we work to illuminate and amplify our collective power. And so I think that early ethos and approach that I just described really still is a guiding light and a guiding force in our work. And so I wanted to share this recent example, which Kirsten mentioned in her introduction, which was called The Right to the City, an exhibition project, where we really look to address the urgent issue in Washington, D.C., and is an urgent issue in many communities, both nationally and globally for that matter, of gentrification or neighborhood change. Washington, D.C., as I mentioned, was a majority African-American city, the first major U.S. city to have a majority African-American population beginning in the late 1950s, was proudly known as the Chocolate City for many years, in recognition of the majority African-American population, and also as being a kind of symbol of Black political power. In 2012, or thereabouts, 2011, 2012, DC was no longer a majority African-American city because of the rapid gentrification in recent years, and particularly the displacement of long-time and low and moderate income African-American residents to the suburbs. And so we wanted to really contextualize the change that was happening in the city, historicize it, but also really highlight how and why it was that neighborhoods changed and transformed over time. And also, I think importantly, in working collaboratively with local organizers and longtime residents, document histories of how communities came together and mobilized in the face of change or the threat of change to either preserve their neighborhoods or remake them in ways that serve their needs and interests. And so I wanted to share a bit about this particular project and the process, particularly the development process of this exhibition, because I think it offers insight into how we approach our work. One thing that's really key to I would say, many of our projects is oral history, just given the dearth of historical sources in many cases, written historical sources. We see it as central to our practice to do oral history as a way to, in a sense, correct or at least enrich the historical record with the narratives of those who lived in and made the city's history in many senses. And so over the course of several years, we sat down with nearly 200 individuals, from longtime residents to organizers and activists to architects and planners to government officials, to really document the history of neighborhood change and community activism. So that was a really important part of the process. Again, not just to document those histories, but also to ensure that the histories that were being narrated in the exhibition itself would reflect or be told from, as much as possible, the perspective of those who had lived through this history and helped make it. We also, over the course of several years, hosted community forums where we would bring together a range of community members, stakeholders, quote unquote experts. In this case, community members were the experts, to just hold forth on topics related to the topic of gentrification and neighborhood change. So we had, in this case, a community forum about the impact of gentrification on the arts in Washington, D.C. We held a forum on the impact of gentrification on public education in D.C. We held neighborhood-specific community forums where we talked about the histories and the change experienced in particular neighborhoods, in this case, Washington, D.C.'s Chinatown, which has a really rich but often overlooked history, and also is also one of the neighborhoods that has experienced rapid gentrification over the past couple of decades. These are just a couple of images from the exhibition itself. And so now I want to say a word about how it was that once we had worked with the community to document, preserve, and share through the exhibition the histories of neighborhood change and community organizing, we also wanted to take that content beyond the walls of the museum into the city, and in some cases into people's homes. And so these are just a couple of images of the exhibition itself at the museum, where we featured 6 neighborhoods, the history of 6 neighborhoods and the neighborhood's residents. And then one thing that we did in the exhibition itself was actually repurpose a payphone. So I had collaborated with a professor at American University, Benjamin Stokes, in the School of Communication, to repurpose a payphone to turn it into a storytelling system where people could actually pick up the payphone, listen to clips from oral histories that we had recorded, and then record their own story. And that was actually tied to a digital system that allowed people to call that phone number from their own phone to do the same thing, to listen to clips from oral histories or record their own story. And so we had sort of small phone cards or business cards that had that phone number on it that prompted people to share their stories. And so those things could be passed around, not just among family members, but to neighbors. And I think became, a great way to open up a conversation about the exhibition, but also for people to share their own stories and reflect on or respond to what they saw. We also, I think really importantly, partnered with the DC Public Library. Libraries are such crucial parts of the social fabric of communities in ways that I think go underappreciated. They're not just libraries in the strict traditional sense. They're places where people gather. They provide social services. And so we partnered with them to feature kind of pop-up or satellite exhibits in the neighborhood libraries where we had done the work with communities. And so in the same communities where we had been collecting oral histories and holding community forums, we also were able to put up these satellite exhibits and also had the storytelling hotline, that phone number, storytelling hotline available in those same libraries. And so we had these phones, and in this case, in this particular library in the Mount Pleasant neighborhood, where there's a large Latinx population, we had two phones, one that was in Spanish and one in English. Again, really just trying to create access to as broad set of communities as possible. And we also had another version of the payphone that we would take out to events. In this case, we had an event, a kind of a panel discussion community forum at a local bookstore / cafe restaurant. We also brought it out to the longest running neighborhood street festival in Washington, D.C., the Adams Morgan Festival, where again, people could listen to stories, record their own as people did. And we partnered with the Humanities Truck, which is based at American University and is really just a kind of mobile humanities vehicle that we outfitted with content from the exhibition. We had oral histories. You can maybe see there on the truck in this photo, there's a large monitor or screen on the outside of the truck. We were able to have oral histories playing. Again, really just trying to think outside of the box and imagine the ways of sharing these histories outside of traditional museum spaces. So yeah, on the inside of the truck, there was content that people could engage with. And then we also created this interactive texting game, if you will, where the people had these postcards where you could text the phone number, which was the same phone number you could call and listen to or record a story, where when you texted that phone number with one of these numbers of different locations in the neighborhood, you would get a historical photo with some information about that location. And you could kind of follow that throughout the neighborhood, again, exploring the contemporary sites and getting a sense for what history helped shape the neighborhood. And I think the other thing that, as much as we were able to, similarly with the community forums, the idea is really to make this museum as much as possible a site for community, for community building. And so being able to host discussions and tours for all kinds of groups, organizing collectives, elected officials, and agency directors and the DC government and their senior staffs, nonprofits that are working on social justice issues, to be able to be in dialogue with them, both to hear from and engage with them around these issues, given the urgency of gentrification and related issues, became one way also to bring the museum and the exhibition to life. And then finally, I'll just mention that we had hosted a symposium as well, where we brought together, I think, trying to break down these traditional barriers between organizers and activists on one side, policymakers on another, scholars and academics on another, still to really bring together scholars, organizers, and policymakers to have these conversations that often are not had about these issues that are in the moment transforming communities. And so again, it was a way to bring people, in this case, from across the country together to talk about these issues and think about solutions moving forward. So there's much more that I can share about our museum's work, but I thought I'd share in particular this project, The Right to the City, that I think exemplifies in some ways our community-based curatorial practice. So looking forward to being in dialogue with you all. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Samir. This was really wonderful, and just to hear about the history of the Anacostia Museum, and to hear about this long arc of community engagement, the long historical arc of community engagement that has always been at the center of your museum. And I love seeing the phones. And I thought back to the cargo bike that Angela showed us, how you take the museum outside of the walls of the museum, and how you construct these connections. And then Adam, how he's sort of in creating new positions within the museum. And this is an art museum, and so we have three very different kinds of museum that we have brought into conversation here today. So I think we have a couple of questions already from our audience, and Deirdre will pose these questions to you.
We have two wonderful questions, and I encourage any of our panelists to respond, or all, perhaps. You may have something you'd like to contribute. The first is, what is the relationship between belonging and community participation? To what extent do museums have to prove to communities that they, the museums, also belong? What are the power dynamics of these arrangements?
I'm happy to start that off, especially since sort of belonging was used in the title. So thanks for the question. And just to disclaim at the outset, the obvious point, which is that my colleagues on the panel represent institutions that are much more advanced in their execution of this than we are. And while art museums ought to apologize for that, it is also the state of things, right? So we move forward to address the structural issues that this generation has inherited. And it's amazing to be on a panel with individuals who represent institutions who've done such amazing work from which we are learning. We actively benchmark against both of these museums as we seek to build in their best practices. So in answer to that question, I guess just a few things. First is, I would make one further distinction between community participation and community creation, which I think we just heard a lot about. And I think that's an important distinction for logistical reasons, if nothing else, because as broad as your outreach efforts can be, you'll never get 100% community creation. You'll get deep and wide and representative community creation. And that's really, really important to achieving a sense of ownership and community participation. Certainly that's something we've found in our nascent work, and I think it's reflected in the other conversations, the other presentations you just heard. But to carry on a comment that was made at the end of Angela's presentation about what's the metric for success. So as we seek to commit to quality and develop a culture of belonging, we've decided that the way we're going to measure success is not through visitation, but through repeat visitation to the permanent collection. That is actually the measurement we are going to use to determine whether we are doing our job. Because if people don't feel comfortable and reflected in our permanent collection galleries, then as an art museum, which is dedicated to preserving our permanent collection, we're not doing our job in creating that culture of belonging. And I would say, therefore, that community participation is a prerequisite to creating a culture of belonging. And the tactics that one uses, that an organization uses, I think have been better outlined by my colleagues than by me. So I'll sort of stop my answer there, except just to say that the layers, sort of filling in that grid of 4x4, we are pursuing a lot of the same programs and projects that you heard articulated at the other two institutions. So in short, there is no belonging without community participation. Oh, and just to say on the power dynamics, we do have to prove that we belong. The good news is we have structured our program around being invited in, and the feedback is consistently, where have you been? Not get out of here. But it does require the institution to get out of its sense of propriety, to realize that it doesn't know everything, and to be open to serving and to learning. So I'll end my response. Thanks for that great question.
Is there, like, Angela or Samir who would like to add to that?
Thank you also from my side for the question. And as Adam said, I also would say that there can't be belonging without participation. I think that's really fundamental, that the museum is not only perceived as an institution where you visit, maybe you take some friends or visitors to let them know something about the city, but that you really kind of feel that it's also a bit of your institution that you helped also to form. And what we observe with the City Lab projects, and also with the Library of the Generations, the projects which I couldn't present tonight, that people often say that after participating or taking part in one of the programs, they really feel more that they belong more to Frankfurt than they did before. One participant once said, I always knew that I was a resident in Frankfurt, but now that I told my story and there were people listening to my story, I really feel being at home, or I really feel this is more my city than it was before. And this happens quite a lot of times, that people feel more, how do you say, rooted, or have a deeper relationship to the city. And these are the moments where I'm also quite happy, because I think, okay, the work I do in the museum means something, has meaning for someone. And it's not just kind of a consumerist habit that I consume and visit culture, but I really kind of engage with the city story, or I really tell a story and there are other people listening to it. And the question about the power dynamics, I think it's, for us, it's quite fundamental to say that we set the frame with the City Lab, that we structure the process, that we finance also the project. And I think to be quite clear about this, also power relationships is really helpful. So we also, when we start a project, we have kind of a code of ethics, where we also define that anti-democratic, sexistic, racist enunciations have no space in this, and that we try to create a safe space where everybody feels comfortable and at ease. And we also made the experience that, for example, if there are some problematic enunciation, it's also very important to have this group. So it's not us to be kind of the judge or to say this is okay, this is not okay, but also that the group is really regulating itself. So we think it's a very open process in a clearly structured framework, which really enhances kind of the feeling of belonging of the people. Not only that they think that our museum is relevant, but also their attitude towards the city changes. I would stop by this.
Deirdre, do you want to?
I think Samir was just going to comment.
Oh yeah, Samir. Sure.
I mean, I'm happy to, but I'm also happy since I see that there are other questions to also move on if that's useful.
Well, you certainly would have a lot to say to that question.
Yeah, any just quick comments?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just, I think that, I mean, it's a really critical question. I think, the way that, just given the brief presentation, talking about our founding and then this recent project maybe suggests a neat and tidy kind of just almost continual sense of community connectedness. And really, I think of it much more in terms of a practice. In other words, it is not a static kind of unchanging, deep community connection that exists across time, right? It's really requires continual and active engagement and collaboration. And so I think about it in that sense that, it's in our name, Community Museum, but that's only meaningful insofar as we actually practice that, which I would say, has over time has varied, as also, the priorities of the museum and the scope of the museum has shifted, sometimes being more nationally focused, sometimes being more locally focused. And so, I just wanted to add that I think about it as an ongoing practice, not as, some static, unchanging fact, just because it's in, your museum's name or your mission, right? It's really at the level of meaningful practice.
Thank you. I think that was a wonderful addition. We have a number of questions now. I'm not sure we'll get to all of them, but let's, the next one has to do with how the different institutions pivoted this rich work during the pandemic, specifically to digital formats, and any particular strategies that you found to be successful.
Maybe I'll jump in first this time just to say, I think, well, one thing I'll mention is that in the case of A Right to the City, we had, not long before the pandemic, just happened to have launched a kind of digital version of the exhibit on the Story Maps platform by Esri, and which became useful when obviously the pandemic began, so that people could visit. It's not a virtual walkthrough of the exhibition, but it allows some of the content to live online, and so that was one thing. But and we also did shift all of our programming online, and I think had some really great and engaging programming. But I think that the adaptation that we made was not, that I think was the most impactful, was not necessarily the digital, because I think everyone was forced to move digital, but what was actually in person, but outside. And so two things that we did. One was we were going to host a traveling exhibit called Men of Change, which had been developed by the Smithsonian Institution Traveling Exhibit Services, and had traveled to a couple of sites already, but we were going to host, as a traditional exhibition in our museum, and we're able to transform it to be outdoors in a very specific neighborhood, also east of the Anacostia River, but in Northeast DC, called Deanwood, where the exhibition was about particularly African-American men of change, in various fields, from medicine to science to the arts. And so it was both visual art, but also stories. And so in that case, we were able to work with the local community to focus local men of change, quote unquote, from that specific neighborhood. And it was an installation that was done in partnership with a local high school that specifically was a high school that was for African-American boys and young men, and also connected to a recreation center. And so, again, it was a way for us to take this content, which, again, we were going to host as a traditional exhibition inside of our museum, but put it outside so that it would still be accessible in a safe way for local communities, but also, I think, was able to enhance the exhibition by creating this local element to it. So that was one thing. And then the other that I'll mention is our most recent exhibition called Food for the People, Eating and Activism in Greater Washington, which looks at these issues of inequalities in the food system, everything from so-called food insecurity or hunger to disparities in access to grocery stores to et cetera, which again, we were in the middle of developing when the pandemic struck, and we began thinking, okay, one, we don't know when we're going to reopen, and two, how do we begin to make this available for local communities? And so we transformed the front plaza of our museum, took some of the content that was going to be inside and brought it outside. And we were able to open that before we reopened our museum to the public. And so in April of last year, we debuted the outdoor component of this exhibition, which features art installations, a sculptural tribute to essential food workers, profiles community members that are working to transform the food system into a more equitable and sustainable food system, and allowed us, just to adapt to the pandemic by using the outdoors, and allowed for people to come and experience our museum in a way that we hadn't traditionally been doing. So those are just a couple of examples I thought I'd share.
Thank you.
So I was preparing a new project dealing with traces of Nazi history in everyday life today. And we had a first in-person meeting the end of October, and then there was the second lockdown, and we switched to online meetings. So I never thought that it would be possible to kind of create a City Lab project or develop it online, but it worked extremely well. And I think with this, well, it meant also kind of an exponential growth of communication for us on the curatorial side, because we didn't workshops with 38 people, but we did 38 meetings with individual people. And then we tried to connect the people in order to make this intersubjective or thematic exchange to make this possible. And so we created kind of communicative extra formats, and this worked extremely well. And I asked myself, why is it like this? And I think the virtual space was kind of a safe space. Everybody was at home, was safe, and that made it possible to kind of communicate maybe more personally or overtly in the digital space. And it was really a great experience I didn't expect. So, and then we met the next time in person in July 21. So most of the development was done online, and that was so beautiful to see how people really kind of were longing to see each other to meet in person. And then we had really kind of a celebration there in summer, an outdoor event, and people were so happy to meet personally after working together really closely and intensely for half a year in the digital space.
And I'm happy to say something, Deidre, but given time, if you wanted to move to another question, I'm also happy to move on.
Well, we are, I think, kind of at the end of time. So if you had a quick comment about the way you worked with digital or not during the pandemic, I think that would be a nice concluding comment.
Terrific. Yeah, I'll keep it brief. So, so 2 points. So the first is being an art museum director in the midst of COVID, you totally lucked out because as it happens, the filtration required, right, the air handlers required to maintain temperature and humidity controls made us the safest indoor space in the world, according to a Berlin technology. Call, since I'm on my phone, so navigating back to our Zoom. So we felt it was very important to in-presence experience for people who are seeking solace throughout the pandemic. I also began my tenure in April 2020, and I think the only other point I'd make about digital is much has been made of the digital pivot, but kind of as Samir was saying, the organizations that could take advantage of it were the ones who were investing in it or who already had content. And even though we're still in the grips of another surge, hopefully ameliorating, the history of pandemics from one Roman historian to this group is they do go away or they become endemic. So rather than reacting, we thought it was more important to develop the strategy that you saw that anticipated something resembling a new normalcy. So we didn't want to overreact and end up investing in a less than stellar solution. What we did do, though, was rather than overthink it, we turned to some of our emerging partners and said, how can we help? And we did end up devising some curricular content for the Toledo public school system, but it was not an idea we had, it was an idea they had, and we put ourselves in the service of community.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. We are unfortunately running out of time. Here are a few really interesting questions about the role of museum objects and thoughts about how your museum practices have changed, how you look at the museum object, how central the museum object remains to your exhibition practices. That is, again, of course, different for Adam in the art museum than for Samir and Angela. There's a question directly for Samir. Did Anacostia exhibit impact, policy, or social change? So we will save these questions. We will forward these questions to Angela, Samir, and Adam. And I am just so happy that we were able to meet in this virtual space and that we heard from all three of you. And I thank you very much and wish you, Angela, a good evening, and to all of us here in the United States, a good day, a good Monday, and a good week. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.